Hello again, listeners to Community Radio Northern Beaches. I'm Michael Lester, and the program is Innovation Talk. Our topic for today is the long relationship that we've had with our native forests here in Australia since colonial times when we've exploited the resource. And it's come to a point really where we've compromised the sustainability and biodiversity values that these forests can give us. There's been long battles along the way, but the industry itself, by some tellings, the forestry logging industry is perhaps, as we'll be discussing, an industry and a system that looks broken and in need of rethinking and revisioning. I'm delighted to be welcoming to our program today Australia's preeminent biologist of ecosystems and particularly of forest systems and ecology, distinguished professor at the ANU, David Lindenmayer, who's been awarded the Order of Australia. He's with an considerable array of published material, some 14 or 1500 articles and 40 or 50 books. We're going to be discussing with David today, who's joining us on the line from Canberra, his latest book, The Forest Wars, subtitled The Ugly Truth about what is happening in our tall forests, and it's published by Allen and Unwin this year, 2024. Thank you very much, David, for taking the time to join us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
David, you've had a long life and career and a lot of passion and commitment tied up in your relationship with these tall, wet forests and trying to understand them as a scientist. What particular ecosystem are we talking about here when we talk about the tall, wet eucalyptus native forests? What are they? Why are they special? And where do we find them in Australia?
So most of my work has been in what's an area, a region called the Central Highlands of Victoria, which is about 90 minutes northeast of the MCG. It's an area of about 80 kilometres by 80 kilometres. But the tall wet forests also relate to places in Tasmania, Western Victoria, around the Otway Ranges, up into the mountains of northeastern Victoria into New South Wales. And there are also areas of tall wet forests right along the Great Dividing Range, right through New South Wales, further north, Barrington Tops, Nightcap Ranges, and right up into Queensland. So these are pretty widespread kinds of areas. They tend to be on the most productive soils, the highest productivity areas, and also where there's good rainfall. So they're the tallest trees, usually the fastest growing trees, the most productive areas, which also means that they're often targeted for logging and often very intensive kinds of logging, such as clear felling or clear cutting.
What sort of trees are we talking about here and species, and what are their features and characteristics in particular? I guess we're talking about mountain ash, among other things, are we?
Yeah, mountain ash in Victoria, but also alpine ash and shining gum. Tasmania mountain ash, shining gum, and called messmate. And then on the north coast of New South Wales, you might be dealing with tree species like flooded gum, Eucalyptus grandis. So there's a range of tree species here, and they're characterised by being very fast growing, generally very tall, often very large in diameter. And in many cases, the forests are dominated by a single cohort of trees of the same age. And so, for example, when you cut the forest, you cut them with a clear fell or a clear cut. You remove all the trees in one operation, then the forest regrows as a single even age cohort of trees. So that's what we see in mountain ash, alpine ash, flooded gum, those kinds of environments.
What sort of ecosystems are they part of generally in terms of the biodiversity values?
In Victoria, they're called tall, wet and damp forests. It's a special, what's called in Victoria, an ecological vegetation class or an EVC. And there's similar kinds of classifications in Victoria and Tasmania. They tend to have a lot of deep, wet forest kinds of animals, lots of greater gliders, yellow-bellied gliders, powerful owls, sooty owls, and lots of small forest birds, particularly associated with that sort of dense, wet understory. So you'll often have majestic, very large old trees, giant eucalypts, and then underneath those, you'll, in more cases than not, have quite a dense, luxuriant, very wet rainforest or wattle layer underneath the overstory eucalypts. And then often again, another layer, which will be tall shrubs, tree ferns, other kinds of vegetation. So they've got lots of structure in them, different vertical layers, and I think probably characterised mostly by their really giant trees, but also the sort of the deep, wet, luxuriant rainforest layers. And it really makes for an extraordinary, almost cathedral-like environment. Beautiful bird calls. Nighttime's fantastic with all the different species of possums and gliders in the forest. Extraordinary places, really.
There's also the land and the water. And what sort of ecosystem services, to use a jargon term these days, do these sorts of forests deliver?
In the case of the wet forests outside of Melbourne, almost all of the water for the 5 million plus inhabitants of the city come from these forests. And what we see for many of our major cities is that the integrity of the water catchments is crucial for the integrity of the water supply on which our cities depend. And so most of the water for Melbourne comes from these kinds of forests, but in many, many other parts of southeastern Australia, these tall wet forests are very important water catchments supporting cities and other urban settlements. So that's a really crucial ecosystem service. But another one that many people don't realise is that when these forests are in their old growth state, they also store vast amounts of carbon. And so these are among the most carbon dense forests on the planet, storing, in some cases, almost 2,000 tonnes of above ground biomass. And that's crucial for tackling issues with climate change, because not only do we need to reduce our emissions, for example, from transport, but we also need to store more carbon in our forests as part of better balancing the carbon budgets that are presently way out of whack at the moment.
Your book basically draws on, say, nearly 40 years of research, but obviously on much broader research availability too, particularly to look at the impact of the way in which we've logged and managed these forests over the decades and continue to do so. You put forward a number of myths or mythologies that are put forward by the forestry and logging industry interests in support of what they do, presumably give them some degree of social license, which they seem to have had for a long time. In terms of biodiversity, there are a whole range of myths that are put out that you believe are mythologies not substantiated by science and data about the relationship between logging and its favourable impacts on biodiversity.
That's right. So I've spent my whole career, more than 40 years, looking at the relationships between disturbances like fire and logging and the integrity of the forest. And so one of the myths that's often promulgated is that when you log a forest, it's fine because the forest grows back. And we only log such a small part of the landscape, doesn't really matter. And the reality is that often when you log these kinds of forests with these intensive harvesting regimes like clear cutting, actually the animals die on site, not just from having the forest cut down, but often what happens is that the logging slash or the debris that's left on the forest floor, and there can be hundreds of tons of it, is then consumed in these very high intensity regeneration burns. So any self-respecting animal that managed to survive the carnage of cutting all the trees down would be then thereupon barbecued by these incredibly high intensity fires. But what's also very important is that when we log forests, we're focusing logging operations in the most productive parts of the landscape, which also happen to be some of the most important areas for many elements of biodiversity. And even though a comparatively small area, maybe 5, 6, 7,000 hectares of forest is cut in any one year, across a rotation period of 80 to 100 years, with that kind of forest area being cut every year, you end up with very large amounts of the most productive bits of the landscape cut at any over the rotation time, or what we know as the time between when a forest is first cut down and then when the logging operation is repeated. And so what happens is that we get quite severe cumulative effects of cutting many bits of the forest over many years, which comprehensively changes the whole fabric of how these forest landscapes are put together. And it can take quite some time, many decades, for the true impacts of these cumulative effects to be realised. And you have to do very long-term studies to be able to pick this out. But we've been able to do that over the last 40 years, and we do see some really serious long-term negative impacts on biodiversity as a consequence of doing these kinds of things.
Some of the most controversial work I understand that you've been doing over the years has to do with some of the mythologies around the logging industry and the work they do in managing forests and fires.
This is a really vexed issue for me. I remember after the 2009 fires in Victoria that killed more than 160 people, and I lost a number of friends in those fires, including where we used to stay for our field camps. The people that ran that lodge, this place called Nandabinya Lodge, they died in that fire. 4 people died in the spa on that Saturday afternoon in Victoria. And I remember giving a seminar about the post-fire recovery process for the forest and for the associated biodiversity. It was a scientific seminar until right at the end, when there was a Q&A, and someone called out from the crowd, "If it wasn't for you effing greenies, none of this would have happened." The response at that time was, well, let me restate your statement, even though it was supposed to be a question, as a hypothesis. And that is that your hypothesis is that if we log the forest, then fires will be less severe and have less damaging effects on the forest. And I admitted that I didn't know the answer to the question, but I took the question on notice to then go away and research what had happened. And the review that we did and published in late 2009 was that, in fact, in drier forests, there is some evidence that logging, some kinds of logging would reduce fire severity, but in wetter forests, it had the opposite effect. It made forests more flammable. And then it wasn't until 2014 that one of my colleagues, Dr. Chris Taylor, unearthed a data set basically showing that when you log forests, there's a prolonged period of time where the flammability of that forest is elevated as that forest regrows. And then there are other studies now from researchers at the University of Wollongong, researchers in Western Australia, researchers in Tasmania that are showing broadly the same thing. And that is that forests that are logged and then regenerated have this prolonged pulse of flammability as they mature. Our work showed it lasted for about 40 years, this elevated flammability, but work at Wollongong showed that it occurred for at least 70 years. So what we now know is that logged and regenerated forests, not only in Australia but in other parts of the world, are more flammable for prolonged periods of time after they're regenerated. And this effect is so strong that we see it in quite a marked form after the 2019-20 fires that burnt through such large areas of New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria. So we know that now an intact forest always burns at lower severity than a log forest, but the effect is so strong that a log forest burning under moderate fire weather still burns at higher severity than an intact forest burning under extreme conditions. And so this has really got enormous implications, not only for the forest, but for people living near these forest environments.
A further thing that you mentioned in the context of logging and fires is an interesting couple of mythologies around, say, burning your way out, hazard reduction burns, and even you believe mythologies around people who maintain that historically these were open park-like forests and that cultural burning has protected all this. So you regard these as mythologies, do you?
Absolutely, absolutely. So what we see, these are myths because we've looked deeply at the science and looked at what the science and the evidence is telling us. What we see is that forests that have been logged, forests that have been thinned, and even forests that have been subject to prescribed burning are all more flammable for prolonged periods after the disturbance. In fact, we've even named this now, we call this disturbance-stimulated flammability. So that's a really important outcome from this kind of work. And when we published that work earlier this year, one of Australia's senior firefighters actually wrote to us and said, "Thanks, David, great paper, but there's nothing new here. We've known this for years, that when we burn the forest, it actually becomes more flammable." And I thought, oh my God, this is one of Australia's most senior firefighters telling us that they already knew all this stuff, which is really quite a revelation. But one of the problems that underpins this idea that we can thin and burn our way out of this problem is this myth that tall, wet forests were open and park-like at the time of British invasion. And we've just published a paper just a couple of days ago that we've been working on for a year or two that indicates that that indeed is a myth. Tall, wet forests at the time of British invasion were actually very wet, very dense, and were not the kinds of places that you could gallop a horse through or pull a horse and cart through at all. Their natural state is being very tall, very wet, and very fire resistant. They were not subject to widespread recurrent cultural burning. That is wrong.
One might even suspect that it's a matter of talking about different landscapes in this context, isn't it? Because we're talking specifically, as we've said, about these tall, wet forests, eucalypt forests, native forests. But of course, they're not the only forest types or vegetation types around the country. For example, dry, temperate sclerophyll forests, which may indeed operate in a different way. Another of the arguments that's made in support of the logging industry that you regard as a myth on the basis of the evidence is that we need logging, and in particular that we need it to build our houses and our furniture.
Absolutely. That myth is promulgated regularly. You know, I hear it almost every time I go to Parliament House, and there's been a lobbyist there for the industry saying, "Oh, there'll be 1 million houses we can't build if we don't log our forests." Well, that would only be the case if we build our houses out of cards and paper, because the native forest logging industry, Tasmania, Victoria, and large parts of New South Wales, particularly southern New South Wales, generates almost exclusively wood chips and paper pulp. Up to 90% of everything cut goes into the paper pulp, box liner, and wood chip stream. The reality is that nearly 90% of sawn timber in New South Wales and Victoria is already coming from plantations. In South Australia, it's been coming from plantations for over 30 years. And similarly, in Queensland, most of what gets cut from forests in Queensland is actually from plantations. And so the plantation industry has really dominated the high-value sawn wood product component of the industry for many, many decades. This notion that we won't have wood if we don't log native forests is a complete furphy. The people who argue that are either being duplicitous or they don't know the structure of their own industry.
Well, we do hear a lot, don't we, in Australia, including recently, about the need for us to have value added to our natural resources. But I think, again, another myth that you address here, in your view, is that native forest logging claims to be value added. But in fact, you believe that the evidence shows it's not even value adding, but value subtracting.
Absolutely. We know that the value of native forests is in them continuing to stay standing up, not cutting them down. And the true value in those forests is for their production of water, their storage of carbon, their opportunities for ecotourism, and the opportunities for other kinds of employment, including controlling feral animals and controlling weeds and fire. The notion of turning native forests into wood chips and paper pulp is one that significantly detracts from their values. And we know this because we've done formal economic and environmental accounting, and we've shown that the value of forests for water is up to 25.5 times the value of forests for wood chips and paper pulp. The value of tourism is about 20 times, and the value of carbon is at least 4 to 5 times, and in many cases much larger. The reality is that wood chipping and cutting native forests really is subtracting the value of forests rather than value adding.
And in terms of its direct employment impact, which is often claimed to be in the many thousands, if not tens of thousands, what do you believe the evidence is telling us there?
The evidence comes from the Bureau of Statistics. It comes from places called ABARES, Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Studies. What we see is that employment levels in places like Victoria before the industry closed were about 550 people. Southeastern New South Wales, it's about 280 to 300 direct and indirect jobs. Tasmania, across both the plantation sector and the native forest sector, is in the realm of about 830. So probably Australia-wide, we're talking about an industry that's less than a few thousand. And so when I hear these claims that the native forest logging industry is putting bread on the table of tens of thousands of Australian families, that's just complete rubbish. It does not fit with any of the data on economics from any of the most important sources. And the reality is that other industries such as tourism have way, way higher levels of employment and have much, much higher multiplier effects on regional economies than the native forest sector does.
Our guest here on Radio Northern Beaches Innovation Talk is David Lindenmayer. We're discussing his book, The Forest Wars, The Ugly Truth about what's happening in our tall forests. And you talk about the sort of business model, if you like, that's been used, which has been a state-owned forestry model, which presumably is put in place for profitability reasons.
Well, the reality is that native forest logging has lost vast amounts of money for the taxpayer in every state that's operated. So in New South Wales, for example, in 2019-20, about $250 million was handed to Forest Corporation of New South Wales, yet it still made a loss of about $30 million. In Victoria, the last 2 years, Vic Forest, which is a state-owned company in Victoria, lost $269 million and still has a loan for $80 million that it'll never be able to repay. But, the mozza of all comes from Tasmania. The Tasmanian economy has had to prop up Forestry Tasmania, and then its renamed entity, so-called Sustainable Timbers Tasmania. That has cost that state over $1.5 billion. And the reality is that these are enormous losses to employ relatively few people and have major negative impacts on the environment, major negative impacts on carbon emissions, and huge impacts on water supplies and biodiversity. It's nonsense what's happening here. The cost to the economy is enormous. The cost to the environment is enormous. And we employ relatively few people, very few people, in an industry that inflicts this kind of damage on the environment. It's beyond ridiculous, really.
As you observe, and we do often hear that this is the forestry logging industry is the best regulated industry, logging industry in the world. We have in place regulators, and in fact, we put in place a number of years ago, much lauded and awarded internationally, I believe, a series of called regional forestry agreements, which seem to address these forestry wars that have been going on for some time.
Well, again, this is a myth. The myth that we hear that we have incredibly well-regulated forests in Australia. When we look under the hood, we discover that, for example, vast areas of Tasmania's most important habitat for the critically endangered swift parrot are being logged. We see extensive breaches of logging prescriptions in states like Victoria, where a country that's on steep slopes that shouldn't be logged is routinely logged. Up to 75% of logging coops have logging breaches because of those slope requirements. Areas of logging exclusion zones actually turn out to be clear felled. New South Wales, important areas of habitat for animals like greater blighters end up being logged, and there's not proper pre-logging surveys either in Victoria or in New South Wales. So the notion that Australia has the world's best regulated forests just doesn't stack up relative to the evidence.
The question of the sustainability, of course, is sustainability is such a much discussed objective these days. The industry claims that they contribute to sustainability.
Oh gosh, yes, the sustainability myth. This idea that the logging industry is highly sustainable is actually also not supported by the evidence. The reality is that forests have been woefully overcut in many parts of Australia. And in the case of Victoria, one of the reasons that the industry was called to a halt was that there was very little timber that was left that could be turned into a saw log. And the same is happening in New South Wales. And some pretty ordinary things happen. And we know that this has been going on for a long time. So one of the first inquiries into overcutting in Victoria was in 1898. And so we've seen this extensively right across the board, that there's been far too much cutting and the rate of cutting is too fast relative to what the forest is able to sustain. But at the same time, the more forest we cut, the more that regenerating forest becomes more flammable. The more flammable it becomes, the more likely it is to burn. The more that it burns, the more we have to focus our logging operations in the unburnt parts of the landscape. The more that we do that, the more flammable forests we create, and this cycles in on itself. And what we also see happening is that as time goes on, parts of the industry fall away. So the saw log component of the industry starts to subside, and more of the industry becomes focused on wood chips and paper pulp, which means that you can cut younger forest, which means that you've got less chance of getting saw logs, which means that you cut more pulp and wood chip, and the more you do that, the less saw log you get. So again, the sustainability component of the industry falls away. This is now starting to really become a major problem with the more fire that we have in these very fire-prone landscapes, that the availability of timber's starting to erode significantly. And it also means that the only place that we can get a serious wood crop is actually from plantations where we grow the timber faster, and you can get that crop before the plantation burns. And so there are fundamental issues with sustainability that get ignored regularly, in part because forest managers often forget to take into account things like the timber that's going to be lost as an inevitable consequence of widespread wildfire.
We seem to be caught in a bit of a negative feedback loop there, heading towards perhaps a collapse of both components there. You've made some mention in the climate change context about the ecosystem service provided by these forests for storing carbon. But part of the arguments that the industry makes is that the best way to store carbon is to cut down forests and regrow them.
That one is an absolute furphy. So the bottom line is that the industry doesn't count the emissions that it creates when it cuts a forest down. So large parts of the biomass in a forest are actually not used for timber products. They're used for wood chips and paper pulp. Many hundreds of tons of logging slash stays in the forest after the operation. But the timber products that are produced, the wood products, are mostly wood chips, paper pulp, that have a very short term in the life cycle before they go to landfill and start to contribute to carbon emissions. So, for example, in the state of Victoria, at the time the industry closed, the industry was generating about the equivalent of approximately 730,000 motor vehicles worth of emissions every year. In Tasmania, it's closer to 1 million motor vehicles emissions every year. New South Wales will be something similar. Those emissions are significant, We know that if we stop native forest logging tomorrow, we could actually reach our greenhouse gas reduction targets by 2030, as promised by the federal government. But we also know that the forests with the most carbon that's stored are actually old growth intact forest. And so what is happening is that the industry is deliberately mixing up this notion of the rate of growth of trees, which is fastest when trees are young. So that's what we call a flow. And they're mixing that up with a stock, which is how much carbon is stored. And the most carbon that is stored most securely for the longest term is actually in old growth forests. And that's important, that people that are reading this book and getting themselves up to speed about what's happening, it's important to understand that long-term carbon storage is the most important thing, and not to confuse a stock with a flow.
You do say that over recent years, some politicians have stood up and we've had legislation and statements and promises to the effect that, might suggest that these forestry wars are pretty over and settled. But I think you argue in your book, because you believe that we're likely to continue to see this sort of native forest logging for a long time to come.
Absolutely. So let me give you a case in point in Victoria. So the Victorian government announced in May 2023 that it was stopping native forest logging. Yet not long afterwards, it was clearly negotiating with First Nations people around this notion of what's called forest gardening. Now, forest gardening is just logging by a different name. Now, when I think of gardening, I think of people cutting roses or mowing lawns. Forest gardening is actually logging. It's actually cutting down a significant part of the stand basal area of a forest, taking out those trees to a sawmill or to a pulp mill. And so what's actually happened is that the native forest logging industry has moved now from parasitizing the public purse to starting to parasitize First Nations corporations. And so the forest industry has written a forest gardening strategy for First Nations corporations, and now it's doing the logging for them, telling them that they're going to make large amounts of money when in fact almost every logging industry everywhere in Australia has made significant losses over the last 2 decades. So it is one of the most cynical and disgraceful acts that I have seen in many years of natural resource management, where the forest industry is now taking advantage of the most disadvantaged people in the country. And this whole notion of quote unquote forest gardening, which supposedly, according to the strategy, will heal country, quite clearly damages that country. And you can see large slash piles, you can see compacted log landings, you can see large numbers of logs that are taken out of the forest. It's a logging operation and it's highly damaging. So when the government says on one hand that they're stopping native forest logging, but then forest gardening takes hold in another form under a different name, you can see why people are sceptical that the industry has really ended. And we're seeing the same kinds of very cynical moves now taking place in New South Wales and in parts of southwest WA. And I think it's really important for people to have their eyes open to this kind of bullshit on steroids, frankly.
Well, look, thank you very much, David Lindenmayer, for joining us on Innovation Talk Radio Northern Beaches. With your very sobering conclusion there about the forest wars that seem to be perhaps continuing. You do, to be fair, in the book, forward a very positive vision about how we ought to be relating to and managing our forests, but unfortunately we don't have time, and readers and listeners should pick up a copy of your book, The Forest Wars, published by Allen and Unwin, to take a look at how you would see some perhaps way forward towards a more sustainable relationship with our forests and natural resources. Thank you very much, David, for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. And yes, there is a very positive trajectory for forests if we manage them in a different way. And I think that's the antidote to the myths, the potential for something much better. So Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for joining us.